Hello and welcome to the third season of Against the Law, the myth-busting ancient history podcast that aims to separate historical fact from mythical fiction. It seems like only yesterday we were recording our very first episode, but then again, time flies when you're having fun. Just like in the previous seasons, if we come across a historical misconception, you'll hear this noise. That's the sound of the Against the Law gavel smacking down on fake facts. If I can take a minute of your time, I'd like to introduce you to our Against the Law team. Right on time, we have Zenia, who can spend hours chatting about the ancient Romans. And on the second hand, here's Meg, who has all the time in the world to talk about the ancient Greeks. We're also joined by Barney, who'll be really ticked off if he hears any misconceptions about his area of expertise. That's the ancient Near East. Oh yes, no fake facts are allowed, not on his watch. I'm Flo. I don't know much about the ancient world, but I'll be keeping the minutes for today's episode. Yes, you may have clocked it by now. We're talking about time. Well, let's start at the beginning then. Do we have a concept of the beginning of all time in the ancient world?
Did the Babylonians know or the Mesopotamians know when the beginning of time was?
Well, they did have a document that stretched incredibly far back in time. Which is called the Sumerian King List, and it's held in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and it's a prism with text on four sides that goes back through sort of mythical kings, even some gods who are supposed to rule various cities in Mesopotamia in deep, deep time, including reign lengths of like 36,000 years.
Whoa!
Yep. So the first king in the list was 28,800 years, called Alulim. This was before the flood for them as well. So I guess that's an interesting way of conceptualizing like the start of time, like antediluvian and post-diluvian, as they say. And interestingly about the Sumerian King List, it's quite popular. It's quite a well-known cuneiform document, I think. And it's similar to Genesis 5, where they talk about the different lengths of the lives of the lineage of Adam.
Oh, and so is the flood the same as Noah's flood as well?
That's the working hypothesis, yeah, that the flood that's described in the Mesopotamian mythical tradition is the same one, that's later described in Hebrew literature.
That's so cool, because the early generations of Adam also lived for ages, right?
Yeah, most famously Methuselah, who was 969 years, Methuselah.
Nice.
Wow. I hope he got retirement at the normal age, though, so he could spend loads of time just chilling out.
But what's interesting, and I've seen a few academics who've sort of lashed those two documents together as both being kind of mathematically generated in the length of time that they're describing, because obviously there's been various theories about the Sumerian King List, like why the lengths that they lived. Is this just this kind of general like golden age where humans and gods lived for incredibly long times, or did they have another way of generating them? And I was reading an academic called Young, who's done a lot of kind of algebra and mathematics applied to these lists, and he reckons that a lot of it is just people flexing their maths curriculum from school, basically. He's big on the number 800. So interestingly, Methuselah's lifespan was 969, which is 800 plus 13 squared. And so he's found all these interesting little like squares and products that lead to the numbers. And the same thing applies to the Sumerian King List. So like the god Dumuzi, who's a shepherd, he's supposed to have ruled for 36,000 years, one of the ones I mentioned earlier, which is just, like 600 times 60, for example. And 60 was the base of their number system. So they're just doing some sums, basically.
I wonder if it's like if you know your family tree, sometimes you know people who are way back because they're sort of like popular and famous. So I know that Charlemagne's in my family tree, and then people after that, you're like, yeah, they're called like Mike Smith. I'm gonna forget about them. But let's just say that Charlemagne lived up until 1940 when my gran was born. So they've like skipped out a load of generations that they don't know any hot gossip on, so they can write about the cool people instead.
Oh, just like cherry picking.
Yeah.
That kind of became a thing in charting Roman time, especially before the standardized calendar of the Julian calendar and then the rest of the imperial period. So before, they used to kind of write about stuff or years in which important things happened or in which important people lived. which did actually lead to quite a lot of confusion, and people would get like the lifetimes of certain people wrong, and they'd get these connections a bit wrong. So, for example, you get Cicero writing to his friend. He's trying to write a history, and he writes to his friend and he says, do you remember this other guy who was talking about this thing that happened when so-and-so met this other guy in Athens one day, and then there was this other battle. And he's actually talking about 155 BC, but that's not the kind of temporal relativity that they were working with. They were like, oh yeah, do you remember when this guy did this thing? What year was that again?
We owe Wikipedia so much.
God, we really do. We really do.
Okay, so that's like reaching back through time. Do we have any information on the very first year that existed, year 0?
Well, I want to go immediately against the law here and say that there is no year 0.
You what?
I know. So it goes straight from 1 BC to AD 1 or CE 1, if you want to count that way. So any nativity plays that are set in the year 0 don't exist. Any exhibitions? I came across an exhibition the other day which had, and in the year 0, we transitioned to AD. It's like, no, there isn't one. Stop it.
What? Wait, what? So it goes from it just starts at 1. Wait, so is that why we're in the 21st century, but it's 2021?
Sort of. So yeah, because there isn't like a 0th century.
Oh my god, I'm criminally stupid. Zenia, stop explaining it to me because I don't deserve it.
So we've got, okay, so if there is no year 0, it flips from 1 BC to 1 AD. And in terms of the centuries, that means that the first century BC actually counts down towards 1 from 99 BC. So actually, the smaller the number when you're in BC, the closer it is to today. And then as soon as you go into the first century AD, then you're counting back up again. So that's 1 AD to 99 AD. That is the first century AD. So now we're in the 21st century, which will be from 2000 to 2099.
My brain was like, we're in the 21st century, even though the prefix to the century is 20. Like, I just didn't take into account that the first century was literally just the first century, not the 0th century.
Yeah.
And I'm big mad about it, and I'd just like to apologise formally that I haven't had any coffee today. It's not an excuse, but it is a reason. Thank you for that explanation, Zenia. So there's no year 0, but I have definitely heard it in vernacular. I've heard it used.
Yeah, I think we assume that we do because the way it's counted is, so BC stands for before Christ, or if you're going BCE, it's before Common Era. And then AD stands for Anno Domini, which is Latin for the year of our Lord. So that means after Jesus.
Why have we mixed it up? Why is some of it in Latin and some of it isn't?
I think that's the medieval people's fault.
Yeah, I think it's 6th century AD people just mixing their languages or speaking in Latin, and then kind of half of it got translated when we officially started using BC and AD. But it's always confused me. I don't like it when people mix Greek and Latin roots as well. This is such a tangent, but like television or polyamory, both great things, but they're mixing their Greek and Latin roots, and that should be illegal.
I once got pericoronitis. It's like a tooth infection, and when I had to miss a Latin lesson for it. Shock horror! And when I told my friends that this was the reason, one of them got really excited and said, "Oh my gosh, that's a word with both a Greek and Latin root."
You guys are such massive dweebs.
Are you suggesting that you might have bullied Zenia and Meg when you were at school for that?
No, I wouldn't have bullied. I'd have silently judged from across the room. Maybe been a tiny bit jealous that I didn't know those things, and probably gone dweeb silently to myself with my 0 friends.
That's worse than the like out loud. Silent judgment is scary stuff. Anyway, sorry, that was a massive tangent. The year 0 and the AD/BC, that is interesting that it was, because it is a bit later, isn't it, that we started actually conceptualizing it like that. I think it's like sort of 600s or something.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. That's a bit beyond the time that we all know about collectively, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
So, how do we measure time for peoples who don't follow Christianity as their religion?
Well, the BCE thing was meant to kind of replace, was meant to kind of remove the idea of having BCE before Common Era and then Common Era, was meant to get rid of the sort of Christian associations of before Christ and in the year of our Lord, or Anno Domini. But I think it's quite a controversial thing in sort of academia, actually, that is it really changing anything if it's still being based around this birth of Christ? We're just changing the words. It's still very much structured around Christ. But that maybe leads us on to the question of when, if the year 0 doesn't exist, when was he born?
So there's about a 10-year window. The dating is attempted according to some timescales that we do get in the Gospel of Luke, which charts Jesus's birth. And the dates or the kind of time frame that we get is very much in the style of how time frames were referred to or decided in the ancient world. And that's like, for example, that famous phrase that gets read out every Christmas, in the year that Quirinus was governor of Syria. So it's like, okay, this guy was in Syria at a certain time, and then we're going to try and base it off that. But then there's also another factor, which is the reign of King Herod, who's supposed to have commanded that all the babies in Bethlehem be killed when Jesus was supposed to be about 2. So we're trying to work out again how those regnal dates work out with the governor of Syria, and it ends up with not one specific date, but about a 10-year window for the birth of Christ.
And is that 10 years before, like, BC, or
it happens over it? So it's around 6 BC to 4 AD. That's the window.
Interesting, because I was reading about this, and there's also, I think, the Olympics, because as we've mentioned before, in the ancient world, an Olympiad, which is the 4-year period, which begins in the year with the games in it, is also a way of measuring time. And I was reading that there's also some potential Olympics dates which might help pin down Jesus's birth, which just blew my mind. The idea of Jesus kind of existing at the same time as Olympics is such a funny juxtaposition, I think. But there's also the Olympics, and Olympiads as a way of measuring time is also interesting in terms of the year 0, because in the ancient world, they were in what we now think of as even years. So like 776 all the way down to 4 BC. But then because there's no year 0, the next Olympic Games after 4 BC was 1 AD. So then they went into odd numbers, which means that when the modern Olympics, I know, this is so cool, when the modern Olympics began in 1896, they were kind of a year out of sync with the ancient ones because of the lack of the year 0. But then, guess what happened last year? The Olympics in 2020 got cancelled.
What Greek god has provided us with a pandemic? Who's the god of pandemics? Because they've put it in place so that we can actually. They've been irritated by that for years, and they've got, no, I've got to fix it.
The 2,000-year itch.
It could have been Apollo who sends the plague in the Iliad. He could have sent us COVID because he was annoyed maybe that the games were out of sync. We're back. We're now, for the first time in the modern Olympics, we've got an odd-numbered Olympic year, just like what happened when 4 BC to 1 AD.
So I get that, like, modern day historians are looking at things from a sort of a less Christian perspective. Presumably, cultures that didn't know about Jesus at the time wouldn't have gone, it is, this year, or it's that year. Like, are there different methods?
I think there's probably 2 questions in this. One that's more ancient world appropriate, like different ways of keeping time in the ancient world, and then one, are there any other systems that exist today? And they are often based around other major religions. So as you just said, Flo, like the one that we use is based around the history of Christianity, but there's also the Islamic calendar, which is based around the actions of Muhammad when he was alive. And the Islamic calendar has AH and BH, which is again Anno Hijri, which is when Muhammad moved from Mecca to Medina, migrated with his followers, and then everything before that is before Hijra. And so the Islamic calendar is currently in the year 1443, for example, but it's not a one-to-one mapping with ours because they have a lunar calendar, so the years don't tick over in tandem. For example, they diverge in time because of the different lengths of the calendars. And then the Hebrew calendar's in the year like 5000 and something. It's huge.
That's so cool. It's literally like that meme of being like in the year 3000.
So I've been thinking about names of months, which I think is quite interesting, and I like month names and their origins, and I like the fact that the name Jason is embedded in the months. So July, August, September, October, November spells Jason. Quite like that. I think it's quite cool. But the other thing that I've noticed is that October, oct meaning 8, November, nov meaning 9, or like non meaning 9, and December, dec meaning 10. 8, 9, 10 are actually not the 8th, 9th, and 10th months of the year.
Mm-hmm.
They're the 10th, 11th, and 12th. And I want to know why, because it's wrong.
I saw an excellent meme on that the other day. It was like, whoever did this should be stabbed. And the reply was, I've got good news for you. So that's the Romans. Well done, Romans, for messing those number systems up. But it wasn't actually Julius Caesar at first. It was because the Roman year used to start in March. And so then you get like September, October, November, counting from there. And Romans counted inclusively as well. So that explains the increase in numbers a bit. But then Julius Caesar changed the calendar so that the months would alternate between 30 days and 31 days, except for February.
Maniac.
And then it started in January. I think that had already become a bit of a thing before, because January is named after he's a god called Janus, and he kind of looks, but he's got two faces, one looking backwards, one looking forwards, and it was about the start of the new year. You look back at the old one, then you look forward at the new one, and you make your New Year's resolutions and all of that. So that's the naming behind January. But then Julius Caesar also named a month after himself, and that was July. That used to be called Quintilis. And then when Augustus, the very first emperor, came to power, he then named the month after himself, so August. And he also wanted to have a month that was the same length as Julius Caesar's month. So then he stole an extra day from a different month and put it into August. So that's where we now have to come up with a rhyme to remember the number of days in each month.
I still use the rhyme.
Man, the Romans are such dweebs.
What is this newfound aggression from Flo this series? Series 1 and 2. Guys, I'm so excited to learn about the ancient world. Series 3, you guys suck.
Oh, what is it about? It's familiarity breeds contempt, and the more I get to know these guys, the more I would definitely give them a swirly in secondary school.
Well, I mean, again, good news. Julius Caesar did come to a sticky end.
That is true.
Zenia, did the Romans all do what the Athenians did, which is also put in random months? Because Athens had multiple different calendars, some of which were competing, and again, it's the issue of a lunar calendar gets out of sync with the solar calendar. So they would sometimes just put a month in, a random month in the year. They'd be like, okay, we're going to have February again or whatever, and that filled me with horror. Imagine 2020, and then the government are just oh, by the way, March is happening. I mean, actually, that's what it felt like, but that would have been real. They would just have been July again, have it over.
Oh, but it does mean that you could have your birthday twice, though, if you're in the lucky month.
I'm not sure that's how it works, unfortunately, because they would call it kind of, February 2.0 sort of thing.
Oh, dweebs.
If you're enjoying the podcast so far, why not support us on Patreon? Our different support tiers can get you merch, shout-outs, and even personalised content. If you want to hear more from Against the Law, find us on Twitter @AgainstLaw, and we're on Instagram and TikTok. Search for @AgainstTheLaw Podcast.
So, in all the things that we've been discussing so far, it's been timelines, right? We've been talking about before and after Jesus, for example, which assumes that, along a line in linear time, we're going forwards through it. And, that's how we express ourselves in English. I look forward to seeing you next week, but the past is behind me, for example. But we shouldn't take that for granted, for an absolute or anything natural, because there's good evidence from the Akkadian language that its speakers, so the people of Babylonia, Assyria, conceptualized moving through time in completely the opposite way. You weren't looking forward into the future, you were walking backwards into it.
What?
It's really interesting. So all of their words for future are related to or a lot of them at least, are related to the Akkadian word for behind, as in behind someone. And all of their words for the past are related to face, as in your face, your visage.
So this is Back to the Future?
Yeah, exactly. And so
Oh
it
my
kind of
God.
makes sense if you think about it, because the past is something that you can remember and you can appreciate seeing all of it laid before you, but there's no way that you can see what's coming from the future.
Oh my gosh, you're so right. You've got eyes to the past. You're kind of going blind into the future. Oh my God, that's amazing.
So it's like painting a line on the ground instead of burning a rope up. You're not using up time. You're seeing what has happened. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I get that.
Mm.
Whoa, I quite like that. Although it kind of sort of fills me with a bit of existential dread.
I think it just feels scary, the idea that your back is facing everything that that will come. That I guess it just emphasizes how little control we have over, or how absolutely zero control we have over what happens in the future.
Right, so I've got the Babylonians and Assyrians to blame for my existential crisis, and we've got Julius Caesar to blame for all the months being wrong because he liked March so much, right?
It was Augustus who stole the extra day for August and messed up the nice pattern that Julius Caesar had created. But I do actually have another Julius Caesar related fact to do with dating. So as we mentioned, I think in our birthdays, or maybe it was our holidays episode, the Romans didn't have weekends, and so the way they kind of structured their days, weeks, months was by festivals. And they also had one more way in which they structured their time, and those were 3 marker points within each month. And the first one was the calends, that's always the first day of the month. The second marker point is the nones, which is usually sort of between the 5th and the 7th of the month. It changes depending on the month. And then the ides are between the 13th and the 15th of the month. So that famous phrase, Julius Caesar, apparently the morning of his assassination, was warned, "Beware the Ides of March." That's the 15th of March.
And he did not beware them. He walked straight into them.
He walked straight into them. He disobeyed the oracle, which is kind of the latest in a long theme of people kind of throughout Greek and Roman history trying to cheat oracles and being caught out.
Can't do it. Look at Oedipus.
Exactly.
Well, don't look at Oedipus.
He can't look at you.
Zenia, we both said that at the same time.
Dark.
Flo, if you were looking for an opportunity to call out any dweebiness, I think one might have just passed you by.
Yeah. Earlier on, Barney, you said that the ages of historical ancient kings were basically a method for mathematicians to flex their skills when they're talking about base 60. So in the Western modern world, we use 10, don't we? Because I've always thought it's because we have 10 fingers, so that's how we count. But I've heard of base 60 or base 6 as being like a method of counting, and what is that based on?
There were multiple bases, systems of counting units in Mesopotamia. They did also have base 10, like we do, the decimal system. But one of their novelties was this base 60 system, which is called sexagesimal. And it's interesting that you mentioned about the fingers, actually. And I think I've brought this up on the podcast before, but it was sort of a throwaway. There's a similar theory for why the Mesopotamians went in for base 60 to do with hands. And it's to do with counting the joints on your fingers. So if you count 1, 2, 3 on your index finger, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 on each of your other fingers, you get to 12. And then if you're keeping track on your other hand of how many times you've gone through that cycle, you eventually get to 60, 5 times 12.
Oh, that's pretty neat.
In the same way that you can count 1 to 10 on your fingers, you can also count 1 to 60 in 5 times 12 from each of your fingers and its joints. So yeah, that's one theory for why, from quite early on in Mesopotamian history, that they were using a base 60 to count certain things, which means that you count from 0 up to 60, and then you get one of the next units, and then you start again.
10 to me, although it is essentially arbitrary and based only on our fingers and sort of the Western way of counting, 10 feels right, and I don't know why it does.
Well, I suppose you're used to 10, right?
Exactly.
Like 60 is a really interesting number because it has loads of factors as round numbers. So it's like it's highly divisible into all these different. So 60 down to 30, 20, 15, and then the other from the bottom up. And whereas 10 has fewer options. And I think that's why this base 60 in Mesopotamia did ultimately cause our division of time as well, via Babylonian astronomy, which divided the sky into 360 degrees, which approximates the length of a solar year, with that 5-day kind of little bit of error there. And so the Greeks picked up Babylonian astronomy, as we know, and then it was maintained throughout the Arab conquest and the Islamic Golden Age, when eventually a Persian mathematician called al-Biruni applied the Babylonian division into 60, this sexagesimal system, to time eventually as well, to minutes. So there's a not direct link all the way through, but the fact that 60 had been used in astronomy eventually carried through to our use that we have in time.
Wow, I love that for him.
Oh, cool. So that's going from time in terms of calendars to time in terms of how we split up our day. Meg, I was reading a book the other day and I came across a water clock used in ancient Greece.
I love the water clock. So there's a water clock in Greek, which is they were used to measure time, especially when you couldn't use a sundial. So in the night, for example, or if you were inside, you might use a water clock. And they're called clepsydra, or clepsydrae would be the plural, I think, and which literally means water thief. So klep is
Kleptomania.
Yeah. And then hydra is obviously water, hydrate. So it's basically the idea of the water is sort of held in a vessel and then drips out at measurable intervals, so you can see how much time has passed. And there was a massive water clock, which I think held 1,000 litres of water in the Athenian agora. But they will also use sort of smaller ones in stuff like in the court. So we talk quite a lot about courts in our crimes episode, and it's really cool. They would kind of give you a mini water clock and be like, okay, this is how long you've got to speak, so sort of you can visualize it, and people would sort of complain, like the Demosthenes, who was sort of Greek rhetorician in the 4th century BC, complained about being asked to speak with only a little bit of water, and he doesn't mean I was too thirsty and my throat was dry.
I got this image in my mind of chess players timing their game with water clocks. So I imagine you'd but in that situation, I guess you'd make your chess move and then plug your finger over the water clock hole.
Yeah.
Nice.
So clocks are divided up into 60 minutes, right? And each minute is divided up into 60 seconds. And there's 12 hours. Well, there's 24 hours in a day, of which you split that into 12. I want to know what. So second sounds like a Latin name to me, like secundus. Do you know what I mean? I've heard someone called secundus. Is a minute called a minute because it's a minute portion of time?
Yeah.
Oh. Okay. Cool. Well, yeah, cheers. That's been our episode on time.
Maybe Zenia or Meg can go more into it. But is the idea that it's like a fine division of something? So minute and minute are literally the same word, just pronounced differently, right? Another
Yeah.
wonderful curveball thrown at us by the English language.
I also would love to know why it's called a second and not a first.
Is that not the second division after minutes?
Oh, what? Is that why it's called that?
Clocks weren't invented for quite a while, so I don't think the Romans counted in minutes and seconds. They also had sundials as well, and there were certain, and so the hours that they had in the day changed according to the seasons, which makes it quite confusing. Because if you say, "I'll meet you at 10 o'clock next week," but 10 o'clock is not the same time depending on the time of the year. In Roman time, is that really confusing?
Gosh.
No, it's not, because the sun is going to throw a different shadow on your sundial.
Exactly. So it's like this many hours after sunrise is what they meant by a certain time to meet someone. And the order in which stuff happened in the day was usually fairly clear, especially for the class that we know the most about, which is the kind of senatorial class. So first thing in the morning, they would meet people at their houses. That was like a patronage-client relationship. So they would meet their clients in their house. And that's literally at the crack of dawn. As soon as first light, you'd get up, you'd start work, you'd go to your patron's house. Then they'd go into the forum for a bit. Then they'd have a little break, and then they'd go to the baths, and then they'd have dinner. But that was all supposed to happen kind of within the hours that the sun gave you that day.
And it would
So
also presumably change like place to place, right? Like local time would be different.
Yeah, exactly. So, for example, there's a Roman account of people who, like Romans who go to Britain, and they just say, it never gets dark. It's insane. Because the hours of daylight that we have are very, very long in the summer and very, very short in the winter. But it's much, much more consistent in the Mediterranean and especially in the Middle East. Like you usually just get your 12 hours of daylight pretty much all the time if you're in the Gulf or in Egypt, for example.
So as well as minutes and seconds and how we have those divisions in English and what they mean, Arabic has a really cool etymology for their word minute. The Arabic word for minute is dakika, which comes from the verbal root dakka, which means to be fine or to pulverize something. And so minutes are the sort of the finely ground particles of a larger thing. And it's a familiar root in the culinary world because there's a Middle Eastern spice blend called dukkha. You know, like a ground up mix. So yeah, the same grinding that is applied to the various herbs and spices that go into dukkha is also applied to an hour to grind it into minutes.
Oh, that is lovely. It's like an hourglass, like the sand trickling through. I love that.
It's very like tactile understanding of time.
Gorgeous.
So I'm afraid that's all we have time for. So we'll end on that lovely poetic grinding of time, and we'll have a look back at our favourite things that has happened in the past half an hour. So Barney, what was your favourite thing about today's episode?
My favourite thing from today's episode was definitely Meg's revelation about the synchronicity of Jesus and the Olympics. I never put those two things together before.
It's weird, isn't it, when things sort of coincide time-wise that you don't expect. Very strange. So Meg, I'm going to hand over to you. What's your favourite thing that you learned today?
Mine was a last minute fact from Barney about the pulverized hour being minutes. I absolutely love that. I think that's beautiful.
Very poetic and beautiful, wasn't it? Yeah. Zenia, what was your favourite thing from today?
Oh, I'm so glad no one else took this because I really liked the concept that Barney described of looking backwards into time. No, hang on. Looking back at time and walking backwards into the future.
My favourite thing about today is the existential crisis that it's triggered in me, and I'm going to spend the rest of my Sunday thinking about time. So thanks everyone for that.